Hi, and welcome to Unplanned, the show about cities and how they work. I'm Sam, your host, and today on Unplanned, we get the great pleasure of talking with Jay Ash, the president of the Massachusetts Competitive Partnership. We're going to learn all about that. We're also going to learn about his time in the Baker administration and also his time at the city of Chelsea, and just get his perspective on where we are today, especially in times of COVID. And with that, welcome, Jay.
Great, nice to see you, Sam. I'm smiling with my mask, but thank you for the invitation to be on, and thank you for maintaining a good distance and keeping the masks on.
I know, we're being COVID safe here.
Yes,
we're being responsible COVID people. So Jay, it's great to have you on. As I mentioned, the show's really about cities and how they work, but you have such a broad set of experiences looking at cities, both from the very particular to what you're doing now. Why don't we start with what you're doing now? What is the Massachusetts Competitive Partnership?
Yep.
What's that all about?
Yeah, so the Massachusetts Competitive Partnership is an organization of 15 of the largest businesses in Massachusetts. And if you think about your traditional Chamber of Commerce, the difference between MACP and the Chamber is that in MACP's case, the CEOs themselves are required to participate. So when I have a board meeting, I have 15 of the largest company CEOs at the table, and these are CEOs not only of statewide importance or national importance, but international importance. And we all come together and talk about the Massachusetts economy.
So tell me a little bit more. So you get all these big players, these heavy hitters, and what are you trying to accomplish in those meetings? What's the organization trying to get done?
Yeah, I guess I'll be a politician and somewhat answer your question.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about sitting with the CEOs is that when they come to this office to have our meeting, they're not focused on their individual businesses, but they're focused on how they can contribute together to the collective advancement of the economy. So we spend an awful lot of time talking about things like education, like transportation, like housing, like innovation, like tax policy, and ways to grow the Massachusetts economy. And what's been really terrific is to get to know these 15 CEOs and see the capacity that they have to think about the Massachusetts economy while they're thinking about their bottom lines. So as you can imagine, being a successful CEO of a major international corporation, you need to be probably a type A, very aggressive, let's get things done type. And so sometimes there's a challenge of having lots of those ideas in the room. But for the most part, what I find is that these CEOs really respect each other's opinions and believe in consensus to get us to a final point on any of the agenda items that we're talking about.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. You know, in one of the episodes of Unplanned, we had the opportunity to talk to Rick Domino, who's managing Better Cities, the president of Better City, and it was kind of that same question of, you know, in this civic space or the civic sphere, you've got these private enterprises that have a lot of employees, they have a lot of money that's sort of flowing in and out of them, and yet you're trying to get them, I assume, to focus in on an issue that has a public component to it, education, transportation. Can you talk to us a little bit about the challenges of doing that? You've been on the public side and now you're working with a lot of private CEOs. How does that work? I mean, how does that work exactly?
Yeah, sure. Well, I've learned to appreciate more the business side of public policy. So growing up and being in government all my life until this very job, I always felt like public policy was more the government domain, and it's not until, you know, as secretary under Governor Baker for Housing and Economic Development, maybe a few years before that, that I started to appreciate that while the business community is the private sector has as much to do, if not more, with how public policy gets implemented and actually becomes successful. So to work with 15 CEOs who are interested in public policy by virtue of them being part of this organization and want to advance good public policy that, you know, helps their companies, but you know, helps the greater economy, is really important. And so when you think about some of the topics that we discussed, let's say education, when you're with the biggest companies, they don't have problems recruiting. right? When you get a call from Fidelity, Sam, you're returning the call, and you want to become part of the Fidelity team. Well, it's great to be with Abby Johnson and see how Abby Johnson cares about the people who Fidelity aren't calling today, but hopefully we'll be able to call tomorrow. And that's through education, and that's through the training that they get, the apprenticeships, and the opportunities that they get to present themselves in corporations. So I guess the answer is that the private sector, and we especially represented here, has a great deal to say about public policy, and then a great deal of responsibility to affect public policy in both its adoption and then implementation.
And when you, I mean, there's so much on this topic, but I want to get to your time in the Baker administration as well. But just staying on this topic for a second, so you're the competitive partnership. Who are you competing against? Is it other states in the United States? Is it other countries?
Yeah, sure. It's other states, and it's also ourselves in some respects. So let's talk about the other states for a minute. Large companies are constantly solicited to move investment and people to their jurisdictions. Heck, I did it for 4 years as secretary, and under Governor Baker, we brought GE here from Connecticut and other things. We can talk about that if you want.
Yeah.
So there's always a solicitation from another jurisdiction about lower taxes, assistance on regulations, connections to community colleges or four-year schools, a better marketplace, things like that. So that's one thing. We also compete against ourselves a bit. There are competing ideas about what Massachusetts should be, and companies are an important part of the overall Massachusetts experience. There are some out there who believe that companies should do more. There are others who think that maybe companies are too involved in public policy and too involved in driving this, that, or the other thing. So in some respects, we're trying to make sure that we have a competitive environment for investment and job growth. And that sometimes means that we need to go to the State House. Sometimes means that we need to go to Washington. Sometimes means that we have to talk with other states to talk about what other states are doing. And it means that we need to find partnerships and collaborations to make sure that everyone's goals are realized for our economy and ultimately for our society.
So let's jump to the Baker administration now. So you were the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development.
Economic Development.
Yep. Sorry about that.
Yep.
And you started right at the beginning of the administration. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was Governor Baker's first appointment to his cabinet, and that was newsworthy because a Republican governor was reaching to a lifelong Democrat to join his cabinet, and it was a real signal from the governor that he was going to run a team that didn't much care about doing things the Republican way or the Democratic way. He wanted to do things the right way, and so it was an honor to be tapped.
Did you know him beforehand?
Yes, we knew of each other. I wouldn't say we were friends. I would say we were acquaintances.
Sure.
We're both tall in stature, and
I was gonna say, and I hope it was okay to say, he's a very tall man,
He's a very tall man.
You're tall too.
So we'd find ourselves in rooms of big crowds, and being tall as we are, we could see over the heads of everybody else, and we would make eye contact and acknowledge each other and continue on doing what we did. I first met him when I was city manager of Chelsea.
Right.
Actually, I shouldn't say that. I first met him when I was a legislative aide working for the state rep from Chelsea. And Chelsea had gone into state-ordered receivership. And he was the secretary then under Governor Weld of the Administration of Finance, who oversaw the receiver. So I've known him for 25 years.
Right.
I've always admired his work, and apparently he did of mine. So he had told me just as the election was coming up that if he got good news on election night, that I should be expecting a call from him. And sure enough, the call came in, and I was very honored to be part of his team.
So you got the call. There's all that chaos of the early days of an administration moving in and office and all that kind of stuff. But you get your office, you get in there, and what did you? Presumably, he had some ideas that he wanted to work on.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing you, and we'll get to Chelsea in a second. But you probably had your own set of concepts about what should happen. Where'd you start in the whole process? What'd you start working on?
Yeah, as I got into office, it was crazy, as you say. I had never heard of the term before, drinking from a fire hose, but every day was the definition of just that. So drinking from a fire hose as we were trying to get all on the same page and get to know each other in the team and what our approaches were going to be. So I show up at the first cabinet meeting, and I expected for sure that there would be some sort of orientation, a kind of Republican administration 101, because heck, half of the cabinet wasn't Republicans. We weren't Republicans. So didn't happen the first one, the second one, the third one, the 10th one. And finally I realized that, he only cared about good policy, not Republican policy, a Democratic policy. So that was really interesting. On economic development, we were, I want to say largely on the same page, but that would suggest that we weren't on the same page. We were fully on the same page.
Yeah.
And it's not unusual. If economic development is not a place where you find much difference between Republicans and Democrats. We're all for good jobs at good wages. We're all for helping communities to find the type of development that helps them develop a tax base that allows them to invest in schools and other things. We're all for helping companies in innovation, and so there was nothing noteworthy of, I'd like to say that, we had to sit down and go through this, that, and the other thing, negotiate things out. No, that wasn't at all. I believed in his agenda. He asked me about what my agenda was, and we agreed that it was the same agenda.
So the two aspects that come to mind, one is more on the urban but statewide issue of gateway cities. I'm fascinated about that, and I also just want to tee you up for housing, because housing's is a debate. It has been a debate. It will be a debate, and it's obviously crucial. But let's spend a minute on gateway cities, and what did you do there? Because they're kind of a fascinating component of the Massachusetts experience.
Yeah.
They've got a lot going for them, but they also have a lot of challenges that they face as well.
Sure, I grew up and turned out to manage a gateway city for 14 years. So,
right.
Chelsea was one of the gateway cities that had long ago received lots of people from elsewhere. The gateway, immigration coming in, and then the gateway helping those immigrants to find their way elsewhere. And so industry came in, industry went elsewhere. People came in from all around the world and went elsewhere. And so we were one of the original gateway cities. When I was city manager, I was advocating for this concept called gateway cities. And so I was at the forefront with lots of other people, including Mass Inc. and a lot of mayors and managers from around the state, in advocating for gateway cities. Had a champion in Deval Patrick, Governor Patrick, who made gateway cities a priority, and then had the fortune of serving with Governor Baker, where he said, we're going to take gateway cities to the next level. And so we adopted in that $1 billion economic development bill and in other pieces of legislation, other policy initiatives that we adopted, further support for gateway cities. And the concept is a simple one to understand. There were times where these gateway cities were thriving metropolitan areas, in some cases anchors to a regional economy. And as the nature of our economy has changed, manufacturing has moved to other places, and old mill buildings are existing, and there's been disinvestment and a loss of the real steam that cities had in terms of their own future. Public policy needed to be directed to help them find the next thing that was going to allow them to not only support their local economy, but serve as those regional anchors. So gateway cities is about infrastructure, it's about housing, it's about job training, it's about matching businesses who can utilize the skills that are there, and about leadership development, and it's about connecting now smaller communities in a larger global world that we're in, and helping them to see their greatest potential.
Yeah. I mean, I've always been fascinated by gateway cities, partly because they are, in so many ways, the American story. Everybody who came from somewhere else probably started in a gateway city somewhere. And but our economy, that old industrial economy, isn't there anymore. And the question is, well, what happens, in a Brockton or a Chelsea or wherever you name it? And it doesn't necessarily have the drivers of, say, a Cambridge or a Somerville or a Boston to help move it along. I've always found that fascinating.
Yeah, in some respects, having grown up in Chelsea, being next to Boston, being next to Cambridge was both a blessing and a curse.
Yeah.
Right. The blessing was that we could get on the 111 bus and go into Boston and go to work. The curse was that no company wanted to move their headquarters of their operations to Chelsea because they were in Boston, and Boston was the center, and Cambridge was the center of all activity. So in a lot of respects, we had to be fleet of foot and really compete in areas that Boston and Cambridge weren't interested in,
Yeah.
or take advantage of the overflow. So during my tenure as city manager, I was able to bring a life sciences company to Chelsea, and that was a result of the red hot, white hot environment that was taking place in Cambridge, right? It continues to take place in Cambridge. You had to look at the overflow, and so as city manager at Chelsea, I used to talk to developers about speed of permitting.
Right.
Something that might take you 5 years in Boston to get to maybe.
Yeah.
In Chelsea and many other gateways are like this, you could get a permit in a matter of months, if not weeks.
Right.
In Boston, there were fight after fight about whether this was the appropriate kind of development for the neighborhood. And you know that's in Cambridge all the time.
Yeah.
Well, those are really, in some cases, those are really terrific development opportunities that Chelsea was glad to take advantage of. So,
yeah.
What gateway cities have had to do is to kind of come together, learn from each other, and develop really good habits to attract investment, to create and then implement good public policy that trains workers for the jobs of the 21st century,
Right.
And look at other things like housing needs and criminal justice issues and the
Yeah.
like. And having a collective group of cities that do that, as
Yeah.
opposed to just one city trying to figure it out,
Yeah.
has been critically important, because it's allowed us to get enough density in people and representation
Right.
to matter.
Right.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
And unfortunately, if you're just one small community, Chelsea's the smallest city geographically in the Commonwealth, 1.8 square miles. If you have the smallest city geographically, it can sometimes be difficult to get everybody's attention.
Right.
But when you lump in with Worcester and Springfield and Lowell and Lawrence and New Bedford and Fall River, all of a sudden now you've got enough people, enough reps,
Right.
enough senators, enough influence to make a difference.
So let's switch to a topic that's related to all of this, and that we mentioned it before, and that's housing. I mean, we could also talk about transportation, but housing's where people live, and it's just been one of the I don't even know how you describe it. We have housing discussions in Cambridge, and they're brutal.
Yeah, sure.
They're usually not a lot of fun. And there's a need. There's a continuing need. I know the governor has been trying to get his voice heard on some of his housing ideas. What was your take on that when you were secretary, and what do you think we ought to be doing right now as well?
So I mentioned this. I mentioned this already. The GE experience.
Yeah, right. And I'd love to hear more about
well,
that.
let me talk about the GE experience as it relates to both Cambridge and housing.
Sure.
So. I was the lead for the governor in going to Connecticut and seeing if we could bring corporate GE to Massachusetts. A tremendous opportunity. It's very rare that you get a corporate headquarters of a Fortune 100, a Fortune 10 company that wants to relocate to another state. So what an unbelievable opportunity. So on the day that the first day that the delegation from GE came to Massachusetts, I had the pleasure of taking them on a tour of the Commonwealth. We traveled in the school bus and went all around the Commonwealth and spent almost 6 hours with them. Well, after 5.5 hours of the hard sell, the salesman in me said, I think I got them. I'm going to turn that off and we're going to do something else. So I started playing a game called Guess How Much the House Costs. It was a great idea to kind of divert their attention from the stuff we were talking about. Unfortunately, I decided to play that game in Cambridge as we were driving back to Boston.
Yeah.
And we went by a two-family next to a variety store. It didn't look all that well maintained. And I'd say, guess how much that house cost? And somebody would yell out $500,000 or $700,000, and I'd go on Zillow, and it was $1.2 million. Right. And the second experience and the third experience, I quickly decided to talk about the Patriots because the housing game wasn't a good one. Right. The point is that there's a deep connection between the cost of housing, the availability of housing,
right,
and the types of employees that you're looking for, right, and the viability of an economy. And it's no surprise that the housing responsibilities and the economic development responsibilities were together in my secretariat as secretary. And we continue to work at MACP on housing because we believe that in order to make sure that we can get the best candidates from around the country, if not world, they have to be able to have a lot of things, including an affordable place to live, and that's a real difficult thing here in Massachusetts.
Well, let's spend a second just talking about GE, because that must have felt like a huge win for you.
Yeah.
And how'd you bring it about? And how did you know that it was even a possible? And I believe they located in Boston, right? Aren't they on
correct. Yep.
4-Point Channel?
Yeah, 4-Point Channel.
Give us a little bit of that background and history and their where they actually ended up locating. Of course, that's a huge city.
Yeah, well, I was the lead on the team, but it was really the governor's efforts, right?
Right.
And at the end of the day, the governor made the calls, both literally, phone calls, and figuratively in terms of how the deal was going to be structured and the like. The folks at GE, what became evident early were two things. One, the Connecticut tax structure had failed them.
Right.
And it's an important lesson for all of us about the relationship between tax policy and job production.
Right.
And in this competitive world that we're in, there are jurisdictions that are throwing free this and grants for that at companies. And when Connecticut just went to the well once too often on major tax hikes, GE finally said, after 45 years of being in Connecticut, that's it, we've had enough.
Right.
Connecticut will never get GE back again. We'll never get, and so there's a tale there about losing things. So one, it's about tax policy. The second thing was, it became evident really quickly that as GE thought about itself as a transforming from a 20th century company to a 21st century company, the thing that was most important to them was innovation.
Right.
And the thing that drives innovation is talent.
Right.
So I told the story about driving through Cambridge and having to hide the housing costs. I didn't hide the fact that MIT and Harvard were there. The fact of the matter is that you have these educational beacons that not only educate the best and brightest, but the innovation that comes out of those institutions is just amazing.
Yeah.
Can't tell you how many times I left MIT as secretary and I couldn't wait to tweet, thank God we have MIT here, thinking about the things that I can only conceptualize, they are actually implementing. So anyway, the story on GE was coming out of a place that had hit them too hard with taxes, and we have a relatively stable tax environment here. And the second thing was innovation driven by talent. And when you look around, and it's not only Harvard and MIT, but it's BC, and it's in Northeastern, and it's Roxbury Community College and Buck Hill Community College, the talent that we have here is really second to none.
Right.
So we knew that we had a huge advantage. Now, you can't rest on that laurel because lots of other jurisdictions are catching up.
Right.
Texas, Austin is really doing well. New York City is unbelievable. We know about Silicon Valley and the opportunities there. Georgia with Georgia Tech and others. There's a lot of jurisdictions catching up, so we need to constantly be working on the talent thing. But the calling card is talent and innovation, and then it's stability of government and what the tax environment is like. And so hopefully those accommodations will continue to be here so that we can take advantage of the opportunities that exist.
All right, let's get to your final topic. And I always at this point just say thank you for joining us on
Sure.
unPlanned.
It's great to be with you.
That's so much fun. Let's talk about Chelsea. So that's kind of where you got your chops in the world of urban and cities, and you were there obviously in a very difficult time. Some people won't know the history of the city, but what was that experience like? I also think you got hired when you were relatively young. I mean, I think you probably was one of those.
Yeah, I was, I think, 38 when I became city manager. So as you can tell, I like to tell stories.
We could spend all day.
So I was the economic development at Chelsea for 4 years, economic development director.
Right.
So I worked in the legislature for 11 years for the local rep, and then decided to move on to municipal government. And so the first big deal I did, Sam, was a company out of New York. I won't name the name of the company to protect them, but first big deal, a company out of New York. And lots of things had happened. I sat down across the table from them, and they said, is my zoning all set? And I said, yeah, I'm the zoning board chair. I took care of the zoning. They said, are my tax relief all set? I said, yeah, I negotiated that with the city council. I was the lead for that. And they said, are my vicular licenses, they were in the restaurant business, are they all set? And I said, yeah. And the guy across the table, God is my witness, Sam, said, thanks. What else do I need to do?
Oh, really?
Winked at me.
Sure.
At that very moment, I remembered the reputation that Chelsea had and earned every bad reputation we had. It was a scoundrelous place for far too long. Ended up in state receivership with so many mayors indicted that we changed the form of government to a managerial form of government. But not even the head of the city council can call themselves mayor, because the city founders did not want, that were writing the new charter, did not want anyone to be able to call themselves mayor. So at that point, I remembered the past, and I also recognized the challenge that we were going to have going forward. That, to equate it to another kind of story, not only were we recovering alcoholics, but we couldn't even be caught in a bar because people would think differently of us. So the trick in Chelsea at the time was to operate so above board with such ethics and integrity that nobody would ever call into question what was going on. And the crowning achievement, frankly, there was a lot of development going on, but the crowning achievement for me was we won the National All-America City competition, not once but twice.
Right.
And it was something that I saw Somerville win in the middle 70s when I was a kid growing up and just involved in civic activity.
Right.
And I said to myself, boy, I would love that my city someday
Right.
could be an All-America City.
Right.
It was such a great honor in 1998 to be able to go to Mobile, Alabama and win. I led that delegation to win the All-America City status of Chelsea, and a validation by third-party experts who had nothing to do with the city that we were doing things right.
I got to say, I was we had the opportunity to be in Chelsea a couple of weeks ago, and I had this thought as somebody who's interacted with municipal government. We're standing there right next to City Hall, and we're sort of in the center part of town, and people are driving by, and they know you, they remember you. Yeah. And I thought, this is, municipal government is really the place to be because it's that level of connection. And some guy rolls down his window and he just says, "Hey, how's it going?" And you know him. You said, "Hello, how are you?" And I just thought, this is really what it's all about. Just another aspect of Chelsea, because my first interactions with Chelsea were when I was being an environmental activist, and of course you have the gas tanks there, and you have a lot of environmental. I was involved with environmental justice groups, and that's got to be a hard one to balance. Presumably, it's important for the region, it's important for the Massachusetts economy, but a lot of it, it all happens in a very small area of these huge gas tanks, basically, that are.
Well, if you're heating your home with oil in Cambridge, it came through Chelsea.
Right.
If you're driving on city streets after a storm and they're not slippery, it's because of the salt that comes into Chelsea.
Right.
Right. When you think about the connections at the Tobin Bridge, my grandfather worked on the building of the Tobin Bridge that divided the city into two. We lost 250 homes.
Right.
It really set the downtown in a wrong spiraling decline.
Yeah.
It's all to support the regional economy. So much that's happened in Chelsea, the airplanes flying overhead, the heavy trucks that come through to support the produce center. Almost every vegetable that you eat at a local restaurant comes through the Chelsea Produce Center. Right. All right, so all those impacts to support the region kind of wore on all of us. Frankly, it's nice to support the region, but how about some stuff for Chelsea? And I have to tell you that during my years as city manager, the state government stepped up, the federal government stepped up, and helped us out a tremendous amount. So we got the largest grants of lots of communities, not only in Massachusetts but around the country, to do cleanups, to promote safer refrigeration, to fix our infrastructure and the like. And so, it's tough. It's tough to bear the burden of many things.
Right.
On the other hand, we're a Commonwealth, and what benefits can we derive out of it? And that was always a challenge. So the challenge was to mitigate those as best you could.
Right.
Certainly not add to it. I mean, during my period of time, there was no additions of oil tanks or salt piles or the like, and to build off the strengths. And the strengths really were. There is strength in diversity, and the great diversity that Chelsea has is really a gateway to what's going to happen in the future to this country. And if you could do it right in Chelsea, you could do it right anywhere as the country continues to be more diverse.
Let's spend the last second just on that component, because unplanned, as I say, almost every episode started because COVID happened, and I started thinking about cities, and we'd basically shut down the region, and that had happened all over the globe. And all of a sudden we could see all these things about cities that you never get the opportunity to shut down a city. So that was kind of fascinating. But COVID has hit Chelsea particularly hard, I think.
Yes, it has.
And what's been somebody who knows the city well and thinks about the regional and the statewide stuff, how should we think about that right now? I mean, parts of Cambridge and maybe Newton, Wellesley, they haven't seen anything close to what something like Chelsea has seen.
Yeah, while I romanticize about all the good things that have happened, what happens in times like COVID is that it reminds people that there's still a lot more work to be done. Right. And Chelsea's tale has been a tale of being an immigrant community, the first place for first and second generations for more than 100 years. I tell stories all the time that whenever you saw strife around the country, the first place you'd see their refugees were in Chelsea. And that came at both an opportunity for us to welcome new people into our world and become more diverse and stronger as a result of it, but pressures on our housing and our education system and the like. And, so as somebody, I grew up in the city, we were homeless for a while. We had to move in with another family, and there were crowded conditions. I think 4, 5, 6, 7. There were like 10 of us in an apartment that was meant to be for 4, right? COVID has again exposed the problem that we have, not only in Chelsea, not only in Massachusetts, but in the entire country, is that there are communities and people in those communities that are living in, that are underhoused, in some cases substandard conditions, and when something bad happens, something really bad can happen. Yeah. It's not unusual in a Chelsea, a little bit in a Cambridge, but not so much, but in a lot of other gateway cities, where you'd see a story, a 3-family house burns, 50 homeless.
Right.
And you do the math and say, how is that possible? It's only a 3-family house.
Right.
It's because of my experience in doubling up and the experience that we have in the immigrant community today, where they've had to share homes. So what we can learn from Chelsea and from other places that have suffered, Lynn has been in trouble, and Lawrence and others, is that we have too many people in a too dense an area that have substandard or conditions. We have people who come to this country to make a go of it for themselves and their families, and they have a very tough time when it comes to jobs, when it comes to transportation, when it comes to healthcare, access to great food and the like. Right. And so we need to be constantly mindful that while cities are welcoming cities, they need to be supported, and we need to continue to remind public policy leaders on the state and federal level that the Chelseas of the world matter and need help.
Jay Ash, currently president of
We're
Massachusetts
going to do this, Sam, right?
Competitive Partnership, and a wonderful guy, and who's made a big difference in the world and here in Massachusetts. So thank you for being on unPlanned.
Oh, thanks for having me, Sam.